I want to thank you for asking me to do this. It has been a pleasure for me to learn, to prepare, to deliver, and to have a conversation with so many of you here, but also separately in so many different places that we encounter each other. Indeed, this is the final of a series, three-part presentation on the enduring presence of Christianity in Lebanon. And indeed, this last part is packed with material, all important material to, in the least, be aware of. So at times, I might seem to be going fast. This is because I need to get to the next point. And if you have a burning question, as Taimin said, ask it. And if you don't, I look forward to having a robust conversation with everyone at the end. Let me also say thank you to the audience, and many of you have attended this all 3 times. So I truly appreciate this. I feel that the work that I did was worthy, and I hope that you have enjoyed it. So we are going to pick up the last 700 years, starting with the Mamluks, ending with really us. As I said the last time, us, we are the Lebanese Diaspora. The defeat of the Crusaders paved the way for the caliphates to return, and 2 of them returned and stayed very long. I'll talk about that, but I'll also talk about the homeland, the mountains, and the coast as well, and how Christians and Druze managed to live together, to share the mountain, and how both of them managed to live and share with everyone else that was there and came there, as many others did. And so, before I go right into the first caliphate, let me just sort of summarize what we will see. We will see that the Christians, having become accustomed to the freedom that they enjoyed after the Crusaders for nearly 200 years, became a little nervous. They lost their sense of security. Remember, that's a long time. No one that was living there then had actually encountered a caliphate before, right? Some people living there, at least as hands changed, as new caliphates came in and others left, there were people there and a word of mouth and so on. In this case, it was very different. And also what was different is that when the caliphates first started to come, neither they nor the people who were in Lebanon or Mount Lebanon knew exactly what was going to happen. Well, this time, the people who are there, who were left behind, knew precisely what was going to happen. And it's documented what happened, and it's said what happened. Essentially, death and destruction. But also one more thing that didn't happen before. Because as we talked before, that Mount Lebanon had people, indigenous people, pagans, even Jews. Many converted to Christianity when Christianity began. But that's it, right? During that period, from the onset of the conquest until now, many more came. The Druze came and became very influential. And also, the Christians felt moving from being majority to minority changed the dynamic. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Sadly, there is much disease, much hunger, and migration. This is the diaspora during that same period. And a shrinkage in population, but also in footprint of Christianity in Lebanon. But also one last thing that is different. When the caliphates first came, there was no organization. Everyone had to fend for themselves. Again, the people of Lebanon adapted and learned and became much more organized, and they knew what to do. And the presence of the Crusaders in Lebanon opened up horizons for them. And that was extremely helpful, as we will also see. So, who were the Mamluks? It's another Sunni caliphate, the Mamluk Sultanate, that began in 1250. It took a little time for them to fully occupy Lebanon, but began in 1250 and ended in 1517, and somebody else came. Originally, the Mamluk and the next caliphate, in fact, were mercenaries. They were hired help, hired soldiers, certainly for the Ayyubids, for the Abbasids too. That's how far they actually went, and they became organized, and they became good at what they do, and they overthrew those that they were working for. And there was real impact as a result of them arriving in Lebanon. They wanted to, the Mamluk, show everyone who was in charge. And that is a new day and a new leader in town. And so at the slightest infraction, monasteries were destroyed, churches too, killings, crop devastation, you name it. And so we all know that the mountains usually fall, and not fully, but submit in a way after the coast did. So it took a little time for all the coastal cities from 1289 to 1291. Remember that the Crusaders came in 1099, right? And left roughly 200 years. After that, essentially 1291, when the last city in Palestine, Akka, fell. And of course, Tripoli was a very important city at the time, much more important than other cities that we talked about during the Phoenicians, like Sidon and Tyre, because Tripoli became a crusader state and lasted. It was among the last, in fact, to go down. So it was very important when Tripoli went down, and finally Akka went down, that was the end. And so Christians' rights were very restricted, but because of the organization I talked about earlier, they put up a feisty fight. We'll talk about that one too. They were still being led by their patriarch, by their brave patriarchs. And sadly, one of those patriarchs, Gabriel of Hijula, was burned at the stake right outside the city of Tripoli in 1367 to protect his flocks. As if the cruelty of the Mamluk was not sufficient, unfortunately, the bubonic plague hit Lebanon in 1347, at-ta'un, right? It came in 1347, and it lasted for 4 years. It began in Europe. It lasted much longer, but the first wave, the deadly wave, lasted for 4 years. It began in Europe, arrived in the East, it basically hit quite a bit of the land under the Ottomans, and it kept reappearing. And in fact, it kept reappearing until early in the 19th century. That is why we know so much about Ta'un, because our ancestors, those who are living, in some cases our grandparents, oh yeah, once Ta'un, as you know, is very contagious, yes, yes, in masses. Once it got to a place. No, 1347 to 1351, this was the most deadly. But these viruses, they just don't disappear. They linger, right? And they go dormant. And something, it just makes them flare up again. This is what we are talking about, these subsequent waves. And they become much weaker and weaker. So people would get sick, but necessarily die like with the first wave and perhaps immediate subsequent waves. The Ottomans defeated the Mamluk. The Ottomans did not arrive in Lebanon until 1516. So the Mamluks, we know that the coast of Lebanon fell toward the end of the 1200s, right? Tripoli was the first among them, 1289, and then finally Akka. But the Ottomans themselves did not bother with Lebanon until they decided that it's time to, for reasons we will also encounter shortly. It's 1516, about the time the Mamluks were packing to leave. Now, one word about the Ottoman Empire, the Mamluk, and the Ayyubids. These three were not Arabs. The previous ones were, in fact, the last real Arab caliphate was the Fatimid. Subsequently, all caliphates, the power shifted. All caliphates had some roots in what we call Turkic ancestry. And obviously, the Turkic ancestry is in such a large swath. Yes, the Ottoman is part of it, right? But also the Kyrgyzstan, for example. Also, the Stan nations are also Turkic. And so they arrived in Lebanon under Sultan Salim and stayed for 400 years. I say they are the most consequential, not only because they stayed for 400 years, it's because they knew what they were doing. For the first time, I would say, this caliphate, compared to every other caliphate before it, they acted like a nation. They had relationships with other nations. They had ambassadors, exchanged ambassadors with other nations. Right? Other caliphates, especially early on, did not. They were totally disorganized. The Ottoman Empire was very organized, and it worked to the favor of the Christians because the Christians had developed relationships during the Crusaders with some of those nations. We'll talk about this. But in terms of treating the Christians in Lebanon, they were the Himis. They had to pay the jizya like everybody else, and at the time it was very steep. The Mamluk actually also had very, very steep, punitive jizya, and some people could not afford it and converted as a result of that. But the Ottomans, because they were also interested in the jizya, they were interested in resources, in kind and monetary, they were willing to take the money and say, okay, do whatever you want to, but don't let us see it. So they were also business people. That is why we have a true semi-autonomous Mount Lebanon under the Mamluk. We shied away from firmly referring to Mount Lebanon as such under prior caliphates. And also the Ottomans, as a nation, an organized nation, perfected something that the West did a couple hundred years after, the census. The Ottoman wanted to know in what smallest vision a new baby was born, because that's more taxes. So they created census, and they were counting every day. On their way out, they counted. Right before the First War, they counted. In 1914, it's the most reliable census that scholars use. They were counting because they wanted, knowing they're going to war, they wanted money and goods. During this period, and because of the relationship that the people of Mount Lebanon, specifically the Christians, all of them, but primarily the Maronites, developed with the West, there was a series of events or activities that are referred to as Latinization. Latinization and cultural renaissance. These are directly related to the connections with the Crusaders, but also the nations that participated in the Crusaders, and that gave Lebanon protection. The relationship with the Vatican was extremely important, and the Vatican took that relationship seriously. 2 synods during that period were held in Mount Lebanon at the time An-Nubin was in Mount Lebanon. One in 1580 and the other one in 1596. 2 very important synods. I'll come back to say some brief words about them. But let me also say, as a result of the first one, a very important higher education institution was formed in Rome on behalf of the Maronites. The Maronite College in Rome, 1584. Basically, 4 years after that first synod. They came for that first synod to the Maronites' turf because they had some concerns about what had happened to the Roman Catholic Church in the West. Right? What did we have? We had a schism. We had a very major schism, the Reformation. And so they held a Council of Trent, to try to deal with the issues that led to that. And they were done. They said, let's find out who else might be doing things that we need to bring in congruence with what we do so we don't have any weak links in our church. They came to the Maronites. The Maronites were ready because they had been working with them since 1182, as we learned the last time we were here. So among the things that they did was the filioque we talked about. Until then, and the Son was not in our creed. It was added. But even as simple as Roman chalices, vestments, and very politely and very kindly, the Pope at the time sent a gift to the Patriarch in Lebanon. And that gift was a form to make hosts, like the host we took today. Because the proper host that we used to take was the host that you take, right? The host that the Orthodox take was essentially bread cut into cubes, right? It was the leavened. And so now that the Pope sent us that very, very nice form, it doesn't have to be that they're forcing us to use them. We have to use them. This is the polite thing to do. And this is when the Maronite made the transition from that Eastern style to the Western style. Of course, others have not. The Maronite College, very important. We'll come back to the Maronite College. It will show up in subsequent slides. But let me just say, some of us were in church last week when we learned more about Patriarch Istfane Dwaihi. Now, I had this in my presentation before I learned that we will have this talk. But since we had the talk, I will be very brief. This is an example of the product of that school, a very important school. Not only a patriarch, but he was a scholar. He was also a scientist, as we learned last week when we were here. He's the historian of our church, the Maronite church. He was sent to Rome because of the gifts that he shown as a learner and as an interested person. He was only 11 years old when his parents acquiesced and sent him, and he stayed there for 14 years. He came back as a priest, and soon after, about the age 40, he became a patriarch and served until his death, one of the longest serving patriarchs, and he was a fighter too. He did what his predecessors did. He protested, especially on taxes, because harsh taxes, we know what sometimes led to. You can't afford it, you don't want to die, right? So you do what you have to do. And he protested because about that time, some dynamics in Mount Lebanon have changed and made people actually much poorer. We're going to talk about the landlords and the taxation system that the Ottomans put in place. Literally starved people. He was always on the move, and as you know, he's on the road to becoming a saint, hopefully soon. Also, during that time, and let me here take the opportunity to emphasize something I said the first time we were here, and I said to others who carried on a conversation with me subsequently, as I said earlier, in so many different ways. Did all the Christians come to Lebanon from Syria? No. Did some Christians come to Lebanon from Syria? Yes. And that's perfectly fine. We know that Christianity started in a place that is very, very near to Lebanon. We know that Christ himself, his disciples, came and preached. And we know that people heard the word and said, I want to be a member of that church, the Christian church. On the coast and in the mountains, there were Christians in both places when other Christians came to Lebanon. But in fact, I also said that the Maronites, while Marmaroon was alive, his disciples were in the mountains of Lebanon preaching the word. They may not have been called at the time Maronites, but that didn't happen until after his death. But when the Maronites, when the patriarch came from Antioch to Lebanon, there were people that shared his faith, shared his culture, shared his language. So Christians became Christians in Lebanon. Other Christians, for all kinds of reasons, came to Lebanon, and that's a good thing. Who came? Not just the Maronites, right? On the coast, as we said earlier, there was a culture of Greek going back to Alexander the Great. It became amplified under the Byzantine influence. They were all called Christian members of the Christian church. But the schisms, unfortunately, if you take away the schisms, everyone there is just that, Christian. But the post-Chalcedon schism gave people denominations, gave them labels. And so we had Greek Orthodox in Lebanon. That church was formed as the Antiochian Orthodox Church in 518. But also others came. They were in Lebanon, they were on the coast, and many more came, and they came to the coast, they also came to the mountains, and they came to other places, right? They came to Kura. We have someone who's a Greek Orthodox from Kura. So they were there, and many more came. The Greek Catholics. Essentially, you cannot separate these two, because the Greek Catholics were Orthodox until 1724. They decided to have communion with Rome, but nothing else changed. They were too in Lebanon, right, because they were Greek Orthodox, but many more came, especially subsequently from Syria, especially during the Ottoman Empire, when many Christians living in the Levant who knew about the semi-autonomous Mount Lebanon and the security that afforded them wanted to be there. But they were there. The Christians were there from day one. But also many others. Armenian Christian. Many of them go back to early days of that era, right? Some Ottomans brought actually some Armenian workers. We had some lead people among the Ottomans in charge as local rulers on behalf of the Ottomans. But that church is a very ancient church. Armenia itself as a nation decided that Christianity will be its religion in 301. Subsequent to Chalcedon, they sort of went back and forth, not committing to anything. And in 610, they declared basically the Armenian Apostolic Church that is neither related to Constantinople nor related to Antioch. They declared their independence then. That's why when I name the patriarchs of Antioch, I don't mention them, because they declared their independence early on. But also a segment of them, of the Armenian Apostolic Church, in 1742, the Melkites in 1724, this is in 1742, also decided to be in communion with Rome. They're primarily present in Lebanon. There was significant splintering of Armenians and others that might come up in the conversation. Please.
So the Melkites joined in Rome in 1724. Prior to that, they were Catholic up until 1054, right? Until the schism, and were considered Catholic.
Yes, yes, yes.
So they rejoined Rome.
Yes, but the real answer here is also it depends on where they lived, right? Yeah, but primarily they were, yes. The Syriac Orthodox, I put them here, I led with the Greek Orthodox because they were there in Lebanon. The Syriac Orthodox came to Lebanon, although they decided to take their own route much earlier, right? In a way, that is the first ramification of Chalcedon, right? Where they said, we don't agree, and we will go our own separate way. And from there on, we see two different lines of patriarchs. Starting in 512, they too had a little bit of a schism. First, in 1677, a group of Syriac Orthodox also said, we want to be in communion with Rome. Soon after, their patriarch, who was responsible for this move, died. And the Ottomans, as a favor to others, this was politics, prevented them from electing a new patriarch, and therefore returned back to the Orthodox Church. Until 1782, they were able to, the Ottomans allowed them to elect a patriarch, and they were in full communion with Rome. They migrated to Lebanon in the 17th century, initially to Tripoli, subsequently Beirut, and as we know, actually, there is a large community in Zahli. And finally, 1517, that's an important year. That's the schism. That's the Reformation, right? So we have the Protestants and very little migration, actually. No one left Europe to come to Lebanon as, or England as Protestant. But the missions, the American and the British missionaries did make some conversions, and they are primarily located in Beirut. One of the questions I thought someone will ask me is, why during that time segments of Orthodox or Eastern rites decided to come back to Rome, right? Because they saw the protection that Europe and Rome was affording the Maronites. And in fact, the patriarch I just talked about, he's responsible for making that connection for them. It took a long time to materialize, but he's the one who said, let me introduce you and then see how you could make this work. That is how it actually happened, because they wanted the protection that the Maronites had. Let's go back to the Ottoman era, right? So many things are happening in parallel. That's why I do things where it seems like I went back 10, 15 years. So many things in parallel, and I want to keep the thought going. So let's come back to the Ottoman. That's an era, Alex, as you just said, we know so much about. I know so much about, not only from school, from my own grandparents, right? There is quite a bit of oral history. I say it's etched in our psyche. What do we know? The one thing that when the older people would talk to you about Al-Asmaniyin was conscription. Conscription. What is conscription? Seferberlik, they would say. They'll use that word, the Turkish word. Seferberlik. Seferberlik means mobilization. I don't want you to get the impression that this happened every day, but it happened every time the Ottomans were squeezed. They were squeezed. They came to not just Lebanon, to other places where they were in charge, and they said, all men, mobilization, you're going to fight in the Balkan. And once you were picked and you were taken, we all know you didn't come back. When you were not useful anymore, you were just left to fend for yourself. Seferberlik. That's what we are told, and that's what our ancestors remember. They also tell us that they were ruthless. Batish, right? They killed this, they killed that, they did this, they hung this. It's actually all true. And they had ineffectual rulers because these rulers were reporting to them. They had to do what they were asked to do, including the collection of taxes. And anyone who was not Sunni, Christians, Druze, Shia, had really a very complex life living under them. The Druze, though, managed to have a good relationship, on, off, primarily because, and when I talk about Imarat Jabal Lebanon, the emirate, you see that the Druze were in charge on day one. How did that happen? They just walked in, the Ottomans and Alman are in charge. They helped the Ottomans defeat the Mamluk. Prior to this, they helped the Mamluk defeat the Crusaders. And so that gave them privileges that others did not have. And there was much suffering, you'll see it, much displacement. And there is some real significant, hard to change impact on Lebanon. For example, al-milli, the millet system, right? That different, specifically non-Muslim communities, different confessions will deal with their own religious matters when it comes to marriage, when it comes to birth, death, and education. But again, among the things that we're told is that but we had a very good patriarch, kept us together and so on. And the feudal class that was so hungry for pleasing the Ottomans and to collect taxes and to send those to Istanbul. All right, so I said earlier that the period leading up to where we are now saw a very significant change in Mount Lebanon. It was no longer primarily Christian. I mean, it stayed majority, but no longer ruled primarily by Christians because a minority that the Christians had welcomed before managed to create a very good relationship for themselves with the Ottomans. And a Mount Lebanon Emirate was created, and two essentially families ruled from 1516 upon arrival of the Ottomans to 1842, a very long time. And these two families are the Man. We're going to talk about them. For now, just remember that the most prominent ruler, I said the last time, was Fakhruddin. The second one, who was a good leader, he encouraged tolerance, but also had his own ideas about what he wanted to do with the Emirate of Mount Lebanon that cost him his life. He was arrested, exiled, and killed in Istanbul in 1635. The second family is the Shihabs, often spelled S-H-I, Shihabs, or C-H-E, which is the current spelling. The Shihab family initially ruled, and I know that there are so many historians that will disagree with this, they will disagree with each other and so on, but to the best of my ability, weaving all that together, they initially ruled as Sunni. What happened is that at some point, the Mans ran out of male heirs. They didn't have anyone anymore. Willing and able. There was an able man who actually had preferred to work for the Ottomans as an ambassador in India. And he was called in, he said, no, I'm happy doing what I'm doing. It seemed like probably a more important job, and said, I'm not interested. And so, no more male Mans to take over the reign. And they were not ready to hand over control to the Christians. So they handed the control to the Shihab family that was originally Sunni, ruled as Sunni, but had quite a bit of intermarriage with the Druze, with the Mans specifically. The Shihab family was in Wadi Taim. Some of you know where that is. Some of you maybe come from that area. And this is very common in Lebanon and elsewhere. This intermarriage is very important. Musahara is very important to strengthen your stature in one place or another. And the Shihab family wanted to strengthen their stature within Mount Lebanon. And so they intermarried. In fact, the first two emirs, they're Sunnis and the mother was Druze. But you can be certain, despite the back and forth of the historians, you can be certain that once you really get to the bottom of it, the most significant ruler, Amir Bashir, that branch of the family had by then become Christian. So he ruled as Christian, he ruled as Maronite. And it cost him. We'll also talk about this. It cost him a rebellion that dethroned him in 1840, and his son was appointed Bashir III. Only lasted 2 years, and the Ottomans did it without consultation, as was the norm. And nobody was happy. And there were other things that we didn't really study as much as I thought we should, because it was an important era in Lebanon, there was something happening also in parallel. There was an Egyptian occupation for a decade at the time. An external challenge. Frankly, I don't remember this as ever being emphasized in anything I learned before, right? But there was. The Mamluk, and I said this the last time, when a caliphate goes away, it doesn't fully go away. They're not all X and somebody comes and then they sweep. No. Remnants stay here and there, and the Mamluk remnants stayed in Egypt. Under the Ottoman rule, there were some Mamluk sympathizers and some ambitious people. Muhammad Ali, who was in charge on behalf of the Ottomans in 1805, wanted independence. And he went to war twice with the Ottomans, even though he was an Ottoman ruler himself. And in 1831, he told his son, "You're old enough to invade too." So Ibrahim Pasha headed up from Egypt from Cairo to the coast of the Levant, starting in Palestine, into Lebanon, into Syria, and he conquered. And he had his own ideas also. He wanted his own place to rule. And he wanted to also raise funds. Very harsh taxation, land confiscation, disarmament, and conscription. Ibrahim Pasha managed to get both the Christians and the Druze upset. If I repeat those words, you'll know why, right? Because who was collecting the taxes for the Ottomans? The Druze, right? Yeah. And Ibrahim Pasha punished them. Said, well, now I'm going to give it to Bashir. Bashir is going to give it to a Christian, to Emirates. He will collect taxes, right? But the Christian, despite Bashir II supporting the Egyptians, the Christians feared one thing, conscription, because he wanted to expand. And he said, well, disarm, and then you join my army. Luckily, they all banded together with support from European nations as well as Russia, and they expelled the Egyptians, gave it back to the Ottomans. The Europeans. They helped throw the Egyptians out and gave it back to the Ottomans. So that's why the Ottomans are still here, right? So they stepped back a little bit from quite a bit of land in the Levant for about 10 years while Ibrahim Pasha was there. And when he was defeated, they came back. There are always backroom deals, as we all know in politics, and some of that happened, and it'll also come up. It was Britain.
You mean Rome?
Not really. Rome did not become involved in these kinds of things. Britain was, we'll talk also about this, Britain was coming up and wanted to show its muscles. And so they were making some decisions. Rome cared more about religious related stuff. Internal challenges. And so as I said earlier, the Druze taking over, becoming the landlords, becoming the tax collectors, gave them quite a bit of authority. Even though they were the minority, they began to make decisions impacting everyone in that part of land. And so, most times there was harmony, but very often there was not. As feudal lords, basically, they got the Christians very upset, because even though they're not setting the taxes, even though the Ottomans did, they were collecting it. And so it created friction where before there was none. When there was none of that, when everybody just paid the ruler. So now, among these two, one became in charge. And so it created that kind of difficulty to interact together. And it led to clashes, it led to destruction, it led to death. And there are two conflicts that we learn in history. One is more prominent than the other, 1840 and 1860. Let's talk about them. And then there was another uprising that is very important to talk about. The 1840 essentially, in terms of importance, in terms of magnitude, was tiny. What amplified it was what was going on in the background with the Egyptians. Between Bashir II, Egypt, who supports who took what from whom, who gave the power back to whom, and so on. And so, as I always say, the ingenuity of the conqueror at work will create what actually happened in 1840. But the significance of 1840, certainly the bloodshed is significant. Certainly the fact that there was no longer Imarat Jabal Lebanon, right? The Emirate of Mount Lebanon is important. But what was important is that for the first time we learn that there are, even though demographically are not equal, there are two equal forces in Mount Lebanon, and they can fight, and they can kill each other, and they can destroy each other's lives. We had not learned of this before until then, and we know why, right? We talked about what happened actually when the Ottomans came. And so Europe, again, in this case it's France, Europe told the Ottomans, hey, we just did you a favor. We helped you, the locals, or we helped the locals bring you back. We want to now have more of a say in what happens in Mount Lebanon. And remember I said that Ottoman Empire then was operating like a nation. There were these diplomatic relationships. And so you'd have to listen and give and take. It was very different than what was before. And so they acquiesced a certain division, right? This sounds a little bit familiar, right? They took Mount Lebanon and they said, let's split this in half. The Beirut-Damascus road splits the Christian to the north from the Druze to the south. Sounds familiar? It sounds really, really very familiar. Let's have two leaders, dual leadership, Qa'am Maqams. One for the Christians and one for the Druze. The Christians, Khat Hashem, that was the dividing line. In Mount Lebanon, that was primarily Christian. But there were, as I said earlier, two strongly equal powers. And so it was split in half. It didn't work. The main reason why it didn't, because the Druze resented this, because now they lost 50% of their power. But the Christians also said, oh wait, we left behind so many other people under the control of others. Below that line, there still were Christians. Remember, the totality is primarily Christian. It was split in half, and more bloodshed came. This time, really serious bloodshed. Al-Fut Miniyyu Sittin, we all know, we all hear, we all studied, we all listened to our grandparents telling us about the massacres of 1860. Unfortunately, a major conflict between Druze and Christians. Again, one can blame, obviously you have to blame the two groups, but one can blame the conqueror for what happened. But also what happened during that short period of division, things took off one place in the Christian area, but did not elsewhere. Christians' relations with the West was extremely helpful from a Renaissance point of view. The other side did not have it, right? So the developments, the infrastructure, and so on. So there was some of that, but primarily it was fanning the fire on the part of the conqueror, and the Christians lost. Their towns were invaded. Everything was burned down. Many people were killed. Let me give you the number of the people who lived there about that time. Only in Mount Lebanon, there are no reports on the census, but it was much less than 500,000, because around 1914 was about 500,000. So 10,000 persons dying during that period in these attacks. And by the way, the Christians, they were both defending and also attacking out of necessity, right? But also anyone who managed to flee was attacked by the Ottomans. So they played a very important role in this. Once again, now you see the pattern. France said, this isn't what Ottomans, we don't like this. We have a relationship with these people and we want them protected. But also something else happened for the first time. Immigration. That is when the Christians living in Mount Lebanon began to think, well, maybe this isn't as safe as it was for us for so many years since we got here. And immigration happened both east and west. I'll say a word now about east. At the time, many traveled to Alexandria and other places in Egypt, but also soon after, the first Lebanese arrived in America. We'll talk about that one too. I don't want to dwell on this, but this is very important. I don't want to skip it. Tani Shaheen, we know who he was, right? Ammiyat. The word is Amma, meaning the commoner. Tani Shaheen was a brave Christian who said, we've had it. We can't eat. Everything we make, we have to give it to them as taxes. And we want to revolt. And revolted. And that was a major change. That peasants from there and on had political representation, and they were able to actually have their own land and live off of that land. All right, the 1860 led to something called mutasarrifiyya. The Europeans said, no, we need something different This Mount Lebanon is primarily Christian, splitting it in half, leaving some Christians behind. It didn't work. We still had problems. People died and so on. We're going to create Al-Mutasarrifiyya in 1861. Still is under Ottoman rule, led by a non-Lebanese Christian. At times it was a Serbian, at other times it was an Armenian, and so on. But it was a Christian leading it and gave the Christian greater freedom in both parts, because it was just essentially one nation, that's called, because it was not a country. And again, as during the short period of having the Qa'a Maqamiyya, the Christians and their relations and their education and everything else that they possessed was put to work. They realized economic growth, trade, especially between Europe and the Near East, Lebanon at the center, and a renaissance in so many different ways. Two major universities, one American in 1866, one French in 1875. Things began to look like, so maybe this is a homeland for the Christians. So this works. This is actually good stuff. What happened next? Remember I said this started in 1861. It ended when? In 1918, right? In 1918, yeah, exactly. War, famine, immigration, and reaffirmation of the homeland. Here's the first war. Very sad, right? I don't have to say much. The Ottomans by then were very weak, referred to as the sick men of Europe, but emerging was a very strong British Empire. Emerging was Germany, France, and Russia. And so countries aligned, one on one side and the other on one side, on the other side. Central powers, Germany, Austria, Ottomans, and subsequently Bulgaria joined Central powers. Allied, Britain, France, Italy, Russia, Japan, and subsequently the US joined. Of course, Lebanon was going to be at the center of it. First of all, we're under the Ottomans. That's where they would fight, among other places. The Balkans was one of them. But also there was the Mediterranean Sea. This was a very, very important theater of operation. As a result of this, the Ottomans busy everywhere else, they eased their grip. So some people thought, oh, maybe this is the time for us to pursue our freedom. But of course, the Ottomans would not have it. That's what would happen to those people who were inclined to pursue their freedom. Very harsh punishment. Again, burning of harvests, public hangings, and so on. Europe knew exactly what was happening. The Ottoman Empire is going down, and they were going up. Even before it ended, Britain and France said, all right, we're going to win, and what are we going to do with the land there? Sykes-Picot. We all know, or we all have heard Sykes-Picot. What was it? It was the division of the land, right, that the Ottoman Empire was going to leave behind between Britain and France, and Lebanon ended up, of course, with France, who always had an interest. al-Hanun, yes. Again, as if the cruelty of war wasn't enough, unanticipated, because the Christians in Mount Lebanon said, look, we have to be self-sustaining. I talked about this the last 2 times. We have to make sure that we have from A to Z, including farms, so we would never die of hunger. But they did not account in their formula for the locust plague in 1915. Nothing was left. Nothing was left for anyone to eat. Drought and locusts simply decimated that agricultural base. The occupier worried about his own belly. They want to eat. They said, oh, okay. Make sure that anything you harvest, you don't sell. You don't move. My soldiers might have to eat. So between that and a prolonged drought, people died of hunger. It wasn't one season. If you didn't have anything this season, if there was no corn, you have no seed for next year. So this was in perpetuity. So when you hear about al-Majaa, you know exactly what happened. It was malnutrition, diseases, and sadly, finally, death in front of the eyes of parents, siblings, and so on. It got worse, this time because of the war. So the Great Famine actually did not end until 18, because I said Lebanon was at the heart of the theater of operation because of the Mediterranean. Ships had to move through that part of the world, right? And the first thing that the Ottomans did, they said, we can't let the British and the French come here. We are going to blockade this. So you have nothing to eat, but you have people elsewhere who can send you something, and the Ottomans will collect it and eat it themselves. Their soldiers weren't going to die of hunger. Unfortunately, also, there was another blockade, right? Those who were fighting the Ottomans said, well, we're not going to let you eat anything. So anything coming to you, we are going to stop it. So important for them, what was going on in Lebanon, that the Ottomans moved their own forces as opposed to their proxies, and they cut the mountains. They were worried about the Christians uprising. They were worried about them helping the Europeans should the Europeans show up. But they also wanted to make sure that nothing comes into Mount Lebanon. So if there is anything that is edible in the Bekaa Valley, they wanted it. It could not be moved to Mount Lebanon. At the time, Bekaa Valley was not in Mount Lebanon. So about that time, according to what I read, the last census taken by the Ottomans in 1914 showed close to 500,000 people living in Mount Lebanon, primarily Christian. 200,000 of them died. I'm sorry? 40% of them died, a little bit more since it wasn't quite 500,000, but yes. Exactly, 40% plus of them simply died. So this period of suffering, death, led to migration. That's why some of you have ancestors here, going back to that period of time. Not only the 1840 and 1860 got them scared, but what was happening on the way up to the war, during it, and after, including disease, the crop devastation, hunger, death, etc. People said, it's true, this isn't the place anymore for us. But also, the Ottomans, this is when the Ottomans would waive the threat of conscription. It happened, but this is when they would waive it. We have problems somewhere else, we're going to take you, you're going to fight on our behalf. So between immigration and death, for the reasons I just mentioned, nearly, or let me say to be fair, anywhere from 2/3 to 75% of Lebanon's population simply died. Just died, perished. But the war ended, and the Ottoman Empire collapsed. They breathed a sigh of relief to some extent. Despite being exhausted, they were not broken. The people living in Lebanon of all confessional lines said, we want the Maronite patriarch to work on our behalf and get us all together our own homeland. We want to be with you. Sunnis, Shias, Druze, everybody said, we want the Maronite patriarch Hwayik to travel to the Versailles Conference and convince them to give us Grand Liban. In 1920, 2 years after, the French declared Greater Lebanon. Greater Lebanon was Mount Lebanon plus every city on the coast plus the Bekaa Valley. The people of the Bekaa Valley fought so hard, including Zahli, to be with Mount Lebanon and the rest of Lebanon. They were not under the Ottoman rule. That was great. And so what happened? Lebanon became the mosaic that it is today. It wasn't just Maronites and Druze in the mountains and call them Byzantine Christian on the coast. It was truly everyone. Of course, we had Shia and Jabal Amr, that was in Mount Lebanon, for example. Sunnis in Tripoli, that was not Mount Lebanon. As a result, Lebanon's population approached 800,000. Take a look at Sunni Shia Druze at the top. The largest was, of course, Maronite. Then Greek Orthodox, Greek Catholics. The Armenians were there. Smaller Catholic group, we know why. The Syriacs were there. There were also some Chaldeans. I didn't mention the Chaldeans earlier because they were such a tiny group. And there were Protestants, and of course, there were Jews. This was a good time for Lebanon. Grand Liban was a good time to the point where some immigrants who had left Lebanon under the Ottoman, including my own great-grandparents, who came to Cuba, came back to Lebanon with my grandmother, a tiny baby. Soon after, The Lebanese were itching, both Christian and Muslim. They were itching. They wanted their own country. They had Greater Lebanon, boundaries, name, etc., but they felt ready now to do it on their own. It took a little convincing, but the French said, sure, you get what you want. Let's think about that a little bit. I won't comment on it. But they gave it to us in 1943, the Republic of Lebanon, from Grand Liban, with a French flag and a cedar in the middle, to a new flag. That's precisely what happened. And we have a pact, right? Unwritten, subsequently written. We'll say when that was written. But in 1943, they said, thank you, Maronites, for giving us Lebanon. You will be the president. Of course, the first president for the Republic of Lebanon was not Maronite, but they said, let's give the presidency to the Maronites, prime minister to the Sunnis, speaker of parliament to the Shia, and let's divide, because the Christians still had majority, the 6-to-5 ratio, more Christians in parliament than Muslims. The first president in Lebanon was Greek Orthodox. Every subsequent president was Maronite because of the pact that we're talking about. This is the last part, and we look forward to dinner and then a conversation. The past informing, or sadly at times not informing, the future. Immigration, post-independence hope and despair, and the instability that everyone continues to live in. So I talked about the Lebanese, primarily the Christians, deciding that it is safer to be far away from what's happening here. And so I think I did show you, did I show it before? I wanted to show you, I wanted to comment on this. That was the first passport, right? So when Antonius Beshalene from Slima came to Boston, he had a Murur Tiskara from the Turks. Murur Tiskara from the Turks. But then when others came, they had a French passport. A lot changed. So many people, if you count those from Mount Lebanon and from the surrounding areas, I would say it was in the hundreds of thousands who left searching for new homelands, left the homeland that they created, defended, protected, many died for, and came here. Favored destinations, of course, the US and Canada, but also, I should have had Cuba here, at least in your honor, but they also came to Latin America. They were Turks initially, then Syrian Lebanese, and then when Grand Liban was created, they became Lebanese. The long road ahead. Every one of you knows it, right? Because in our own ways, that's the road that we have traveled to, even those of us who came in not too long ago, right? But they had it much harder because they came here as peasants. That is all they knew. And they came to places where they were not able to work as peasants. They didn't understand the culture. They did not know the language. And so what did they do? They became peddlers. There is a story that the Lebanese are mostly known as immigrants. There's a story that's very well known. Peddlers. They would just bring the goods, buy the goods, put it in their carriages, and just go days upon weeks away, walking on horses, tired, sleepy, it didn't matter. And they sold. Small towns mostly, but also in large urban centers, and made their money. And they became, many of them, they became very wealthy and very successful. But first and foremost, they focused on what matters, like all of you. Does anyone recognize that picture? Our Lady of Lebanon in Brooklyn. That is the very first thing they did. Churches, but also other things. Schools, hospitals, and so on. So the first Maronite church in nearby Philadelphia, 1887. The Orthodox had their church, the Melkites had their church, in Australia too, and everywhere else. Their diligence enabled them to really do well for themselves, and their children succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dream. I say there is no other ethnic group where their second generation after immigration, second generation becomes, let me start with Latin America, becomes the second generation, right? Parents who were peasants did not know the language, presidents, vice presidents, governors, mayors, successful, the most successful people in business. In America, all of that, of course, except presidents yet, perhaps one of you or one of your children will be, but at least one person of Lebanese descent ran. Ralph Nader. Post-independent Lebanon. This will go fast because you know it, but for completeness, I will talk about it. So the golden age, 50s and 60s, everything is great. Thank you, France. They put a system in place for us. But did we protect that system? That's the question. Because very quickly, at the slightest bump in the road in 1958, there was another war. Kamil Shamoun was our president. Nearby, a new nation called the United Arab Republic, right? That joins two nations that have no boundaries, Syria and Egypt, pressuring Lebanon to join, right? When people ask me about Syria versus Lebanon, and I say there's nothing wrong with some of the Christians coming from Syria. Syria is a fine place, is a fine geography, but Lebanon is special. Lebanon would never give up its name, would never give up its name to merge with anyone, right? But both Egypt and Syria were willing to do that. At least that's what we think, right? Yes, but I'd like to think that it's true. So in any case, the movements of leftist Arab nationalism, the pro-Western policies in the country, it created a problem in 58. Really, we had, I would say, it's called war. The changes in our demographic. The biggest change in our demographic is this. You know this history. I am only going to give facts. Feel free to form an opinion on anything you want, but I will stick to facts. In 1948, we had an influx of Palestinians into Lebanon. If you ask me to summarize the situation of the Palestinians from there until now, starting then really till now, I would say sad. It's hardship. It's impoverished. It's overcrowded. They live in camps, half of them, and the other half are not doing any better because they can't work. They can't join our university. There are too many things that they can do in Lebanon. They can't get social services in Lebanon. The UN has to provide this. At its peak, there was 500,000 Palestinian in Lebanon. Per capita is larger than anywhere else in the neighborhood. In 1967, many more came because there was a war. Many more came. In 1970, many more came from Jordan via Syria, always armed. And those that didn't have arms obtained them. They created training camps. And then they formed a state within a state. This tent city very quickly became this. This camp became this city with the arms and everything else that you can think of. And they began essentially out of staging bases in Lebanon, a war of some sort, the Palestinian Liberation Organization with Israel. And Lebanon was forced in 1967 to sign an agreement in Cairo acquiescing this. The biggest issue with this is that it breached an armistice treaty signed between Lebanon and Israel in 1949, and therefore opened up Lebanon to quite a bit of what we know that happened since. Social, political, security issues combined with regional pressures in this led to our civil war. Many of you, when you visit Lebanon, the first place you want to go to is downtown. That's downtown during the war. These pictures are downtown during the war. I don't have to say a lot about this. We all know what happened. In many ways, we are here because of it. The war ended on paper in 1990 because of an agreement negotiated in Saudi Arabia, and thanks to Saudi Arabia, called the Ta'if Accord or the Ta'if Agreement. It restructured a political system that was really decaying. It also gave more power to Muslims, rightfully so, given the demographics. It also diminished the role of Christians in important positions. The presidency is truly, truly meaningless, unfortunately and sadly. And as a result, they have lived marginalized, and not much has changed. But aggravating all this was the Syrian occupation. The Syrians, on paper, came into Lebanon, or at least occupied Lebanon from 1990 to 2005. In reality, they were actually in Lebanon in 1976 and participating in what was going on with 30,000 soldiers. Syria has always been interested in Lebanon. We've all heard of Greater Syria. It was a pretense to participate in their own ways and impact what happens in Lebanon. Following the Ta'if agreement, presumably the war ended and we did not need any help from anyone. They stayed. It was until 2005 when our prime minister was assassinated. Massive protests forced them to leave. And that, as a result of the war, in addition to what had happened before that, is now allowing and fueling a continuing wave of immigration. Again, I won't dwell on this because you know it. I want it here for continuation. All of this persists. But the worst of it, really, in addition to the delicate sectarian balance that has caused also some of this heartache, is the social, political, and security instability. Much corruption is responsible for this. The deadlocks, the unrest, etc. Economic crisis that has weakened the currency, people can't find jobs, and poverty is on the increase. An outdated system of governance that those in charge refuse to adjust. What happened? I'm sorry to show you this very, very sad picture. It happened in August 2020, and some of you in this room were personally impacted by this. Extremely sad. That's when our nation collapsed. Of course, the Syrian war started in 2011, and the millions of people that poured into our country in this strain they put on our resources are responsible. But also the corruption and everything else that came to a head in 2019 is responsible. But the fact that the Lebanese state demonstrated that it is incapable of protecting its people made it really worse. And who would want to stay in a state that is like that? Unending wave of immigration. We know that this has happened for a long time. We know that it's continuing. We only hope that it will stop. For the sake of Lebanon, before it empties, we hope that it will. One positive thing that I would bring up about immigration is that at least recently they're not going too far. The Gulf states have been very welcoming to the Lebanese. So the Lebanese will migrate, they'll stay nearby. They'll come during holidays to visit parents, to spend summer. They send their children to school and things of that sort. But also, what we, the diaspora, have been able to do for our families, collectively, to individuals, etc., have been the lifeline that they really, really needed. And so how many people of Lebanese descent are outside of Lebanon? It depends on who you ask. These are two very credible organizations. They cannot agree. Let me say a lot. And earlier today, I was running some simulations on my own computer about the 500,000, those who died, minus those who immigrated, those who stayed. Can I extrapolate, had they stayed where they were, what would the population of Lebanon be? And therefore, I know that 5 million live there and the rest are somewhere else. The best number I could get was about 10 million. The Maranat Foundation says there are 14 million of Lebanese descent elsewhere. A very reputable, scholarly Lebanese studies at an important university in America says 4.5. Let's say it's somewhere in the middle, right? I said it's about 10. Let's take that. That's a lot of people that left Lebanon and their descendants. Where are they in America? Well, look at the deepest green is where we are all standing and sitting, primarily on this part of the country. But they're also on the western side. And of course, many managed to be in places we would have never thought that the Lebanese will go, especially when they came on the boat. And it took them months to get here. And they needed to stop in New York City and now find their bearings and then say, oh, I'm heading to Oklahoma. It was very, very difficult. Nonetheless, we are everywhere. This is from the Lebanese census, by the way. Sorry, from the US Census on people who claim to be Lebanese. And so it's definitely incomplete because some people don't know or some people have forgotten. Despite all this, I say we must have hope and we must have optimism. Christianity continues to thrive in Lebanon. Despite all of it, It does. But also, just as important, Lebanon has a very visible footprint, and we are part of this footprint. Who would have thought? Not Marmaroon himself. If you now go and find him and tell him, your statue is going to be on the outer wall of St. Peter's, right? Mora and I were there, and we have a picture right below him. He will say, you're joking, right? He would not have thought that this was going to happen to the Maronites. And it happened. It happened, indeed. And so why did it happen? Because of the communal organization, the ability to adapt. It ensured the survival and the continuity of Lebanon's Christian communities. Let this be a lesson for all of us, at home and abroad. Thank you so much for being here.